Hi, folks. There's a lot of terminology when we're talking about the structures in the brain, so I'm just trying to be here to help organize our understanding of what's going on inside these structures a little bit more. When we're talking about what's going on in the brain, we're talking about these different regions, these cortexes. The first area that I want to talk about is what's going on in an area called Broca's area. Broca's area is going to be in the frontal lobe. Interestingly, it's actually only going to be on one side. Generally, it's in the dominant lobe, so it's normally in most individuals in the left side. What's going on in Broca's, we thought we had a pretty good understanding. As of more recent investigation, we're starting to kind of rethink the idea of Broca's. Historically, Broca's kind of is viewed as the speech generation portion. That probably still has a role, but even individuals that have significant damage to Broca's areas, we could still be talking about individuals that have fairly normal speech. If we're talking about pathologies of Broca's area, we could be including things like lesions on the brain that destroy tissue or tumors in Broca's area. And if we lose Broca's area, oftentimes we can see a change in the grammar and structure. So if we're talking about a sentence like if someone says, "This dog is eating a yummy bowl of food," well, that can lose context and it can lose the grammar structure that we would normally be associating with that sentence. It can become something like dog, food, bowl, eat, right? What that person is trying to get across is the dog eats a yummy bowl of food, but we're missing pieces, right? The language is fractured in this. This is called Broca's aphasia. Another area is going to be Wernicke's area, or Wernicke if we're going to be like super legit. Wernicke's area is located at the intersection of the temporal and parietal lobes. So we have the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe where they meet right at the end at that sulcus line. Wernicke's area is responsible for the generation and comprehension of language. We probably has a role to play with Broca's area. Historically, we used to think that Wernicke's and Broca's areas were like sending signals back and forth to help process and generate language. The current understanding is that it's probably a little bit more complicated than that, but Wernicke is certainly important in the process. If we have damage to Wernicke's area, one of the things that we can have is a condition called Wernicke's aphasia. And someone with Wernicke's aphasia, because of a stroke or a cancer, is going to have a sentence that sounds normal or kind of normal. They might be using a word that doesn't actually exist, but it sounds like an English word or it sounds like a word in their language. Or they could be using words completely out of context, right? So it has nothing to do with the actual content that they're trying to get across. Maybe they're swapping words that kind of sound like that word, or maybe they're swapping words that have actually no relationship whatsoever with what they're trying to say. Generally, Wernicke's aphasia has a lot of jargony sounding words. It almost sounds like somebody's an expert in something that they're talking about, but you have absolutely no idea what they're saying. It can, and you can kind of feel like you're lost with, and you can't really catch up with what that person is talking about, except they're really actually not saying anything, right? Olfactory cortex is another area. Olfactory cortex is going to be at the edge of that temporal lobe, so that temporal lobe on the side, right where it's kind of bumping up against that sulcus. When we're talking about olfactory lobe, this is a little bit simpler. We have a pretty good understanding about how the olfactory cortex works. Olfactory bulbs picks up those smell sensations and it converts that chemical process by which we detect a smell in the air, right? Some volatile coming off of something that smells around us. And then when we send that signal back through the olfactory nerves, the olfactory cortex is the region of the brain that's actually going to receive that information and process it and say, "Oh, that's coffee. That's pizza. That's dirt." Right? All of the different sensations that we're able to recognize as that particular smell. If we have a problem in olfactory cortex, well, that processing is going to get messed up, and we could be talking about conditions like anosmia. Anosmia is I can't smell anything anymore. Anosmia or hyperosmia, right, where I smell a lot, right? Individuals with hyperosmia could find careers working in like the cheese industry to detect certain volatiles coming off of that. That's where a lot of like these super smellers go to those sorts of industries. Or we could be talking about something like phantosmia. Phantosmia as in like a phantasm, as in like a ghost. you're not smelling ghosts, but what you're smelling is you're smelling something that's not actually there, right? I could be sitting in a room and all of a sudden I smell cow manure and there's no cows anywhere nearby me, right? This is a sensation that's being generated out of thin air, like a phantasm. When we have the primary visual cortex, that's going to be located at the posterior portion of our skull, right at the end of that occipital lobe. And this is going to be taking in that visual information that's being processed that's being received by the retina, travels through that optic nerve, and then is being processed and is interpreted by this cortex in the back of our head. If I have problems with the visual cortex, I could be talking about a person that has really high latency, so they see something and then it takes them a long time to process that, and then they can respond as if they just saw it. We could be talking about individuals that really like staring at light or hate staring at light, like they're photophobic or they have light gazing. Or we could be talking about individuals that have a loss of field. So we could be missing out on peripheral vision, or depending on where what the damage is done in the cortex, we could be talking about individuals that can't see what is directly in front of their eyes, but can see on the periphery, right? So they have a change in the field of their vision. When we're talking about the primary motor cortex, the motor cortex is going to be located on that presental gyrus, right? So there's a separation. That central gyrus that central sulcus is going to be separating the frontal and occipital lobes, and that primary motor cortex is located on the anterior portion of it. This does exactly what it sounds like it does as a primary motor cortex. It's going to send out signals to our skeletal muscle, and that's how I'm controlling movements. That's how I'm walking, right? If I have damage in the primary motor cortex, well, then that damage is going to erupt on the opposite side of the body, because the right side of my brain is actually controlling my left hand. My left side of my brain is controlling my right hand. So this is why we're talking about the opposite side. We could be talking about hemiplegia, right? So complete paralysis. Maybe I completely lose functionality. Depending on where we're talking about the damage in this motor cortex, I could lose the entirety of my lower body movement on one side of my body. I could be losing the entirety of movement on one side of my body, right? Or we could be talking about just a weakness, hemiparesis. Hemiparesis is I have a well-developed right arm, I can move and lift things, but my left arm is very weak and I don't have good muscle tone, right, depending on the degree of damage. The primary somatosensory cortex is going to be immediately posterior to that primary motor cortex. It's just on the opposite side of that central sulcus. And this is going to be interpreting signals that are coming into the brain from either touch sensation from our skin or from the proprioceptors that are present in our joints and our muscles, right? If I were to have a ball thrown at me and I catch that ball, well, my arm is going to be briefly pushed back by the weight of that ball that I've just caught. So the proprioceptors, those stretch receptors that are present in my joints and my muscles, well, they're going to pick that signal up and they're going to start squeezing a little bit harder so a ball doesn't hit my hand and I don't just have the hand fly away, right? My muscles are going to immediately tense to try and stop that movement. That's what the sorts of signals that are coming into the primary somatosensory cortex. If I'm talking about a damage to this cortex, we could be talking about individuals that are fairly ataxic, right? So you're kind of clumsy, you have poor body awareness, you're unable to actually position yourself in space. Maybe you think that your arm is higher up than it actually is, something along those lines. Or we could be talking about astrognosia, where you could be talking about an individual that if you have a box covered up with a cloth and you can't see into the box, and you have that individual put their hand in the box and feel around what you've hidden in that, they can feel it, they can move it, they can touch it. They can't actually visualize what the thing that they're actually touching, though, is, right? So you could have a banana in the box, and they can't visualize in their head because they're not processing that information appropriately. You reveal the box, that person sees the banana, and they say, oh, that's a banana. But they're not able to do it through touch. The last one is the least clear one. The insular cortex is kind of the forgotten cortex. It's not the most well-studied one, and it's a little bit more difficult to find. It's actually buried within the lateral sulcus. So the sulcus is that ditch that's running along the sides of the temporal lobe. So you actually have to peel away the temporal and frontal lobe and the occipital lobe to actually look down into it to find this cortex matter. Lots of stuff goes on here, more than I have. I'm trying to do this real quick, more than I have time to even talk about. But we could be talking about like emotion, anxiety, interoception, right? Getting signals from the body, including things like blood pressure signals could be coming through and being processed by the insular cortex. Temperature signals could be coming through this. Perception of risks, right? So lots of different and lots of varied things are happening in the insular cortex. Taste is associated with the insular cortex to our best understanding. What happens when we have a problem in the insular cortex? Well, because we don't really know how the insular cortex is working, our understanding of what happens when it breaks is also pretty poor. One example, though, is pain asymbolia. When we have pain asymbolia, right, A is in without, symbol as in like a representation of something, you can have a patient with an insular cortex lesion, so there's a damage in that brain. You take their hand, put it on a hot pan, they can recognize that they are feeling the thing that's called pain, right? They recognize that it is a sensation called pain, but they're not linking pain with a negative emotion. They're not saying, ow, I need to stop this. This pain hurts. They're recognizing and feeling that pain, but they're not linking that up with the emotions that they should be thinking about. Right? So really, really weird, odd kind of stuff that could be happening with the insular cortex. That's the last one that I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to do a real quick little dive on what's going on inside these cortex of the brain. Okay,